Hi, Ziad.
Hi, Dotan. Can I ask all PESI participants to turn off their cameras and mute their microphones, please? Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's event, which is a lecture by Professor Jennifer Derr, who I will introduce shortly, and also serves as the keynote lecture for the Political Economy Summer Institute of 2022. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University, the Arab Studies Institute, and the Political Economy Project. The Political Economy Project was created in 2015 by a variety of scholars of the political economy of the Middle East to try and bring together various opportunities to learn from one another and enhance and amplify the knowledge that is produced about the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa. We hold various events, including conferences, workshops, an annual institute for primarily doctoral students, but other researchers as well. And we give out an annual book prize, of which Professor Jennifer Derr is the 2020 winner of. And we are so honored and grateful that she can join us here today. Today's session serves as a double event. On the one hand, it is part of a 4-day Political Economy Summer Institute, and at the same time, it serves as a public event to the general audience that are attending us from around the world. Allow me to just say a little bit about the Lived Nile, Environment, Disease, and Material Colonial Economy in Egypt by Professor Jennifer L. Derr. It is a wonderful book that has greatly enriched those of us interested in research and teaching, not just on Egypt, environmental studies, political economy, and the Middle East, but in so many other fields as well. I would like to take the liberty here to just read an excerpt by the Political Economy Project Book Prize judges in describing the accomplishment that Professor Derr's book achieved. The Lived Nile challenges us to think differently about economy, labor, and subjectivity. Tracing the story of the Nile as a living and lived site, Jennifer Derr respectfully builds on while entirely departing from conventional wisdoms on Egyptian history. Beginning in the late 19th century and moving carefully through to the interwar period, The Lived Nile is a remarkable book. Derr traces the building of the Khazan Aswan in 1902, showing how the making of a quote unquote new Nile irrevocably changed the environment, the economy, the laboring body, the practices of expertise, and the power and limits of state authority. Derr invites us all who study political economy to center the environment in all its dynamism and materiality as central to the accumulation and experiences of capital. Similarly, Derr's invitation to understand labor as environmentally situated is a new way to do Middle East history. This book will become canonical, both for its historical revelations and its methodological invitations. Jennifer Derr is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is also the founding director of what I think is an innovative center for the Middle East and North Africa that promises to really further enhance what Middle East studies has done in the past, but probably and most likely take us in new directions. Professor Jennifer Derr, welcome to Political Economy Summer Institute, to the event today. I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ziad, for that exceedingly generous introduction, and to all of you for coming today. I know that you've had a packed schedule, and so I appreciate your time and your attention. I'm going to take just a moment and share my screen with you. I want to start my talk today in the town of Aswan in the south of Egypt. Far from the urban centers of Cairo and Alexandria, and also the busy port cities of the Suez Canal, Aswan lies deep in Egypt's south. And just a second, I have a slide issue here. Aswan lies deep in Egypt's south, which in the late 19th century and the early 20th century was very much Egypt's periphery near its border with Sudan. December of 1902 was a month of celebration and festivity in the town. On the 10th of December, the first modern dam constructed on the Nile River, a dam known as Khazan Aswan, was inaugurated. Local residents of the town, many of whom were also laborers on the dam, commemorated the occasion with song. And I want to read you an excerpt of one of those songs. So one of the folk songs that was recorded in 1902 read as follows. I bought the tickets for those we love, and those who are dear to us are coming. I bought the tickets for the Valley of Aswan, and those who are dear to us are coming soon. I bought the tickets for the Valley of Gina, and those who are dear to us are coming. Welcome our guests who have come. This is a blessing to us, and you honor us. We bake with all of our stored provisions. We kill a big calf of a cow. We lay out a silk sleeping mat bound with gold. Now, Khazan Aswan, the dam that was at the center of this song, so sorry, I'm having some problems. Let me just check. Can everybody still see my slides, or have I stopped sharing my screen? Can I get a note in the chat?
I can see them too.
Did I you can still see my slides? Hold on just a second. I'm so sorry. Give me just a moment. We're having some computer issues here. Okay, can everybody see the slides again? I'm so sorry for this mix up. I'm not at home. Great. Excellent. Okay. Khazan Aswan was the centerpiece in the production of a new Nile River. The construction of this river had begun in the second decade of the 19th century. It was then that the built space of the Nile and the agriculture that it supported had begun a process of transformation. The process resulted in the production of an entity that I refer to in my work as the quote unquote perennial Nile River. For millennia, Egyptian agriculture had corresponded with the rhythms of the annual Nile flood. When the inundation arrived each year, its waters were admitted into large basins that lined the Nile Delta and also the Nile Valley. After they had soaked and fertilized the soil, these waters were evacuated and crops were planted in basins. The new Nile River that began to take form in the first half of the 19th century was defined by the practice of what was known as perennial irrigation. So perennial irrigation was enabled by new networks of irrigation canals that replaced the basins in the fields that had lined the banks of the Nile. With the spread of this form of irrigation, agriculture was no longer concentrated in the season of the flood. Instead, it was practiced year-round. Historians have long linked the transformation of the Nile River to the production of cotton. In the century that followed from 1880, cotton was Egypt's top export, most of it sent to textile mills in the north of England. Khazen Aswan allowed for the storage of irrigation water, which was released when the Nile sunk low and the crop was thirstiest. Cotton was the foundation also of a colonial economy in Egypt, in which cash crop agriculture predominated, industrial development was limited, and the countryside the province of a land-owning wealthy elite. Many Egyptian peasants experienced cotton and Egypt's colonial economy through the poverty that was associated with land loss, with sharecropping, and also with agricultural wage labor. It is cotton and the social relations of the countryside that dominate the historiography of Egypt's colonial economy. My work and the work that features in this book approaches this history in Egypt from a different angle, that of the environmental transformations that enabled political economy in Egypt. So the book that I published in 2019 explores the centrality of the material environment and the production of historical subjectivities, specifically among laborers, engineers, physicians, and colonial capitalists. I argue that to grasp the historical significance of questions of political economy, we must grapple with its relationship to and embeddedness in a broader physical environment. In the Lived Nile, I argue that the Nile is not an always already constituted singular entity, but a realm of practice and a set of temporally, spatially, and materially specific relations that help to structure experiences of colonial economy. So the chronological frame for the book is the century of Egypt's colonial economy, which began in the 1860s and stretched through the 1950s. Its spatial framework is the geography of the perennial Nile River, a geography that was formed by the construction of Khazen Aswan and the other pieces of irrigation infrastructure that enabled the spread of perennial irrigation. During the 4 decades that comprised the colonial period in Egypt, so the British obviously occupied the country in 1882, British engineers presided over the construction of a number of irrigation works, among them the dam with which I began. In the scholarship of colonial Egypt and that of the British Empire, the history of engineering a quote unquote modern Nile River is that of cotton, perennial irrigation, and British engineering. The emergence of this modern Nile is credited to the British, who, according to this narrative, learned the act of irrigation in India and brought their knowledge with them to Egypt. In this body of historical work, British engineers are invariably described as confident experts who would transform the Nile. So this narrative of an expert and confident practice of British engineering is riddled with flaws, many of which I describe at length in the book. Tonight, I would like to offer you just a small window onto one element of my critique, which is linked to our understanding of what it meant to quote unquote know Egyptian irrigation engineering in the late 19th century, and specifically the processes through which an engineer acquired knowledge of the material world. In 1888, hold on just a second. The Egyptian Public Works Ministry was one of the first institutions of the Ottoman Egyptian state to come under British direction. In the early days of the occupation, a British advisor was appointed to direct the ministry, and British engineers were also assigned to different regions of the country to oversee irrigation. These engineers encountered a complex landscape of irrigation, of which they knew very little when they arrived. While most had been posted to India before they came to Egypt, there were stark differences that distinguished Egyptian agricultural environments and the administration of irrigation within them from those in northern Egypt. One of those differences was that Egyptian agriculture depended exclusively on water from a single river. So during their first decade in Egypt, and this is between the period that stretched between 1884 and the middle of the 1890s, British engineers learned to articulate, to measure, and also to interpret the agricultural environment of the Nile River through the frameworks that were deployed by Egyptian cultivators and local officials. In the late 19th century, civil engineering had not yet coalesced as a global field of knowledge that was rooted in a concept of the abstract sciences. Being an engineer relied on one's knowledge of the specificities of local environments rather than mastery of the abstractions of mathematics, physics, and material science. So this was especially true of British engineers who in the 1880s were not trained as specialists in particular fields, nor were most formally trained at all. In Britain itself, the vast majority of those who worked as engineers trained through a system of apprenticeship. In the territories of empire, colonial officials, many of whom were in the military, rebranded themselves as engineers, primarily because they were tasked with building things. Among these things, irrigation works. Now, in this first period of British engineering in Egypt, the reports of the Egyptian Public Work Ministry are replete with examples of the endeavors of British engineers to engage and deploy what I refer to as the vernacular of the Nile River. Engineers learned to use Arabic terms to speak about irrigation. They adapted local forms of measurement and environmental assessment to administer the distribution of water during the annual Nile flood. They also began to understand the calendars that guided irrigation and agricultural production. It is this last subject, that of agricultural time, on which I would like to focus for a few minutes. So understanding Egypt's system of basin irrigation demanded a facility with different systems of marking and recording agricultural time. First, one needed to master the specific forms of labor, environmental management, and cultivation that occurred during each of the 3 seasons of flood-based agriculture. So these seasons were summer, flood, and winter. In their administration of agriculture, Egyptians also often reference the 13 months of the Coptic Christian calendar, which derive from the traditions of ancient Egypt. These months were associated with changes in climate and the specificities of agricultural production. So, within Egyptian dialect, even in a time that is far beyond the rhythms of flood-based agriculture, the 13 months of the Coptic calendar are still used to talk about climate and agriculture and weather. Cultivators and local officials, additionally, often paired Coptic months with the lunar year of the Islamic calendar. Mastering these different calendars and their material linkages to the agricultural landscape was a process that was both complex and localized. In 1888, the Public Works Ministry sent one particular engineer, and one who arises frequently in the history of the modern Middle East, someone who is named William Wilcox, to the south of Egypt to investigate troubles with the system of basin irrigation that prevailed in that region. Wilcox was the most prominent of the British irrigation engineers appointed to Egypt. He had arrived in the country in 1884 to direct its most vital irrigation district, which was located in the Nile Delta, where cotton production was concentrated. Wilcox would remain enmeshed in Egypt's irrigation systems and their politics for the next 4 decades. Now, this evening, I want to read a small excerpt of one of Wilcox's reports from his mission to the South to illustrate his own endeavor to grapple with local practices of agricultural time. Sorry, I keep having a cursor issue. I keep losing my cursor. So this is from a report from the Public Works Ministry. Water should not be permitted to enter any basin before the 1st of Misra, which roughly corresponds to the 6th of August. If an irrigated basin is dry before the 1st of Tut or the 10th of September, it is considered sharaki. If an irrigated basin is dry before the 17th of Tut or the 26th of September, it will yield a poor crop. Now, when one reads the reports of the Public Works Ministry during the occupation critically, the processes through which British engineers learned irrigation by interacting with local Egyptian officials and cultivators on the one hand, and on the other, the material world itself, are plain as day. Not only do the records of this knowledge acquisition help to unsettle the location of technical expertise in the figure of the competent and expert British engineer, they're also one piece of historical evidence and a much larger story about the material and geographically specific processes through which colonial civil engineers were made specifically in place. In 1898, construction on Khazan Aswan began. Approximately 10,000 Egyptian workers, many of them from the Nile Delta and Central Egypt, came south to build the dam. So somewhere around 900 European laborers also worked on the project, these laborers of British, Greek, and Italian origin. So generally speaking, Greek laborers worked with Egyptians to excavate the site and build the dam's rubble masonry. Northern Italian stonemasons dressed the large ashlar stones that formed its outer face. And I'm going to show you in just a second an image of one of those stones. When complete, Khazan Aswan could store approximately 980 million cubic meters of water. When the dam sluices were closed, this water formed a reservoir that stretched 60 miles to the south of the dam and totally transformed the geographies of Nubia, which lay both where the dam was constructed and also to its south. Khazan Aswan also produced a new material field of expertise for British engineers to master, one in which they could claim a unique form of knowledge, solving the quandary that these engineers had faced during their early years in Egypt. Now, what you're looking at right now is a postcard that was of the dam and sent around the world. These postcards were very, very common, and things like postcards helped to make the reputation of British engineering in territories far from Egypt. The dam also turned a patchwork geography of irrigation practice into a relatively more coherent territory, that of the perennial Nile River. Now, I want to take a moment and explain that territory to you in some detail. So looking at this map of Egypt, you'll see that after the construction of the dam, Egypt was divided into two broad regions where irrigation practice was concerned. So right around the town of Asyut, and specifically around the town of Derr, was an irrigation frontier that formed in 1902. This irrigation frontier separated areas to the north, which were irrigated through perennial irrigation, and areas to the south, which continued to be irrigated through the historical system of basin irrigation. Now, just to mark one additional complexity, if you are looking in the south of Egypt, you'll see several blue dots, and those blue dots mark areas of southern Egypt that grew sugarcane and had access to perennial irrigation, not through the dam, but through a kind of privatized irrigation infrastructure that was built by the Egyptian Sugar Company. So by 1906, the Perennial Nile River stretched north from central Egypt into and throughout the Nile Delta. An irrigation frontier formed at the town of Derr in central Egypt, meaning that in the late spring and early summer, the new reservoir that was formed by Khazen Aswan supplied irrigation water to regions to the north of this frontier. Most of the land to the south continued to practice basin irrigation and flood-based agriculture with its single primary agricultural growing season. The territories of the perennial Nile River became the heartland of Egypt's colonial economy. So this was a geography that was defined by its irrigation regimes, and specifically the presence of perennial irrigation, and also the practice of year-round agriculture. British engineers used irrigation infrastructure to colonize the complex temporalities of agriculture that were associated with flood agriculture. Cash crops, whose widespread cultivation was impossible with flood-based agriculture, became dominant. Cotton, produced in the Nile Delta and also in central Egypt, was one of these crops, but sugarcane and maize were also important other cash crops that rose to prominence during this period. Now, it was not simply agricultural ecology that bound the territories of the perennial Nile River. This was also a geography that was produced and maintained by particular configurations of colonial capital. When the British sought a means to finance the construction of a dam on the Nile, Ernest Cassell stepped in with a loan. Cassell was one of an elite group of financiers in the City of London. So most London financiers focused on particular regions of the world, and Cassell's investments range much more widely and included projects in the United States, in Mexico, in the Ottoman Empire more broadly, in China, and also in Russia. He specialized in financing infrastructure and also in making loans to governments. In Egypt, Cassell worked closely with a group of local capitalists whose leader was an individual named Rafael Suarez. While the dam was being built, Cassell, in partnership with some of these capitalists, purchased and resold large swaths of central Egypt that had been held as state lands. The price of these properties were high, as they were the first in line to be converted to perennial irrigation and thus would be able to grow cotton. These investors were also involved in the establishment of local land banks and irrigation companies. Finally, this group formed the Egyptian Sugar Company, which was active in small pockets of the Deep South that had access to perennial irrigation. Now, I want to bring you back to this slide just to point out those blue dots and those small pockets that had access to perennial irrigation. So from the late 19th century until its nationalization in 1956, where sugarcane grew, the Egyptian Sugar Company determined access to land, labor, food, and water. The towns of Nega Hammadi and Kamombo, these were the sites of Egypt's largest sugar mills. These were company towns. When opposition flared among the local population, company agents became the targets of labor actions, of protests, and also of anonymous assassinations. So at several points in my book, I talk about these anonymous assassinations of sugar company personnel, some of whom were clearly involved in violence against laborers, and others who worked in the kind of bureaucracy of the company. So the turbulence that marked resistance in the South was in large part the result of the forms of violence, explicit, structural, and slow, that Southern Egyptians endured and also helped to shape the conditions of sugarcane production. Those who grew sugarcane also worked in mills after harvest. Cane is a difficult and a painful crop to cultivate. Work in sugar mills is hot and tortuous, and it's not a coincidence that on a global scale, the cultivation of sugarcane was often associated with slave labor. The arduous labor of cultivation and labor in mills was made more severe by the violence that supervisors deployed against laborers. The historiography of 19th and 20th century Egypt contains rich descriptions of the plights of rural populations. Among these descriptions, those of conscription, forced labor, land loss, and poverty. And I think it's really important to point out that these policies fell first and hardest in Egypt's south. So one of the projects of my book is to complicate how we conceptualize colonial authority by arguing that it was environmentally rooted, geographically specific, and also entangled with networks of capital. Authority was not the sole province of the agents of the British occupied Egyptian state, nor of the interwar period Egyptian regime that replaced it. Rather, it existed as a kind of assemblage that was linked to the environment of the Perennial Nile and the social relations of colonial economy. In parts of the South that grew sugarcane, this meant that while the presence of the state was sparse, and it was in general in the South, the Egyptian Sugar Company played the role of state proxy, its authority made manifest through the material conditions of agriculture. The historiography of Egypt overwhelmingly focuses on its north. And one of the projects of my work is to think the production of geographies both critically and dynamically. In this case, that of the Perennial Nile River. While this entity predominantly included territories in the Nile Delta and central Egypt, the pockets of the Deep South controlled by the Egyptian Sugar Company also belonged to this formation, their history allowing us to see how the remaking of the Nile River helped to generate new practices of authority and also of resistance. Okay. As with the practice of authority, the relations that comprise the material environment were also an assemblage, consisting of many moving pieces. Perennial irrigation produced a changed relationship between the Nile River and the fields that lined its banks. A common set of ecological changes marked its territories. Under basin irrigation, floodwaters had deposited their silt, a natural fertilizer, on fields. These waters had also washed soils, preventing the accumulation of salts and minerals that might stunt the growth of crops. During the dry season that followed harvest, soil had dried and cracked in the sun, which had aerated it and also broken apart colloids, releasing nutrients and moisture. So with the introduction of perennial irrigation, the flood no longer rinsed fields that were planted with summer crops. Salts and minerals accumulated, which left soil increasingly saline. Year-round agricultural production also meant that soil was not left to dry, and consequently, it did not aerate. As the subsoil water table rose, the earth became waterlogged. Perennial irrigation also meant an increased demand for artificial fertilizers. Cotton leached nutrients from the soil, and floodwaters no longer deposited their silt. By the 1930s, Egyptian agriculture consumed a larger portion of artificial fertilizers per acre of cultivated land than any other region in the world. So within this matrix, Human bodies were also entangled in the ecologies of perennial irrigation. From the vantage point of historical narrative, the process of engineering the Nile is usually both conceptualized and also written as a set of finished acts. So the dam was constructed, perennial irrigation spread, etc. But the process of transforming the Nile and also maintaining this transformation was one of near constant human labor. Human hands dug the irrigation canals that proliferated throughout the countryside. These same hands then cleared them of sediment each winter. Similarly, the practice of agriculture was that of human work. And as perennial irrigation enabled year-round production, so did labor begin to stretch the length of the annual cycle. A year-round agricultural calendar also demanded that cultivators spend more time engaged in the act, the very physical act of irrigation. The 2 and sometimes 3 crops that were produced each year needed watering, which depended on the work that cultivators performed, lifting waters into canals and from canals to crops. These tasks were accomplished with the help of implements that included animal-powered water wheels and also steam-powered irrigation pumps. That agricultural labor during this period was both inexpensive and available, meant that much of the work of irrigation was performed manually. So many cultivators irrigated with the aid of a device which is known as the shadoof, which consisted of a basket or a bucket attached to the end of a wooden crossbar, fitted with a counterbalancing weight and balanced on 2 vertical supports planted in the soil about 1 meter apart. Work on the shadoof took a toll. Men spent the length of the day in the summer sun, whipped by wind and also soaked by the water that fell as they repeatedly raised and lowered the instrument. The lever of the shadoof also scarred their hands. One folk song lamented about these scars. "My wound has gangrene, it has rejected ointment. My wound from the water hardens on me." A poor man's tool, the shadoof and the bodily transformations that it wrought were dreaded, and another folk song expressed, "The stalk of the shadoof made us wood and leather. The stalk is disgraceful, it makes the old cry." With the spread of perennial irrigation, use of what is known as the tanbour, or an Archimedean screw, which consisted of a screw-shaped implement encased in a long cylinder that laborers turned to pump water into irrigation canals, this tool became increasingly common with the shift in Egypt's irrigation geography. While its operation caused less pain than that of the shadoof, use of the tanbour meant more contact with the water that filled canals. The environmental contact associated with irrigation labor helped to fuel an epidemic of environmental disease in the countryside. Symptoms of disease became so common that they came to constitute normative habitations of the body. Now, some of you might be familiar with other notable works that chart the significance of environmental and political change in the production of disease, and I'm specifically thinking of works by Timothy Mitchell and Linda Nash. Now, while my work builds on these approaches, its focus and its argument differ fundamentally. So in my scholarship and my approach, I'm concerned not only with the fact of the appearance of disease and its environmental and political entanglements, but my work also focuses on the centrality of lived experiences of disease to the constitution of the subject. So one of the arguments that I make is that the historical notion of subjectivity needs to be understood as both conscious and also embodied. Now, within the field of Middle East history, scholars have primarily approached the question of subjectivity from the vantage point of categories that include class, gender, nation, and also religion. So my work doesn't seek to upend these approaches, but rather to complicate our conceptualization of subjectivity by reading pain from the archive and arguing that experiences of embodiment are central to how we understand our positions in the world. So the rural populations of the perennial Nile River suffered the ravages of three particular diseases. And those diseases were schistosomiasis, also known as bilharzia, hookworm, and pellagra. Pellagra affected rural populations broadly, whereas schistosomiasis and hookworm affected laborers in particular. Now, I want to begin by describing schistosomiasis because in many ways it's the most important and the most prevalent of these diseases. So schistosomiasis in Egypt is caused by two particular parasites, Schistosoma hematobium and Schistosoma mansoni, which produce the disease. And also the tiny freshwater snails that serve as the intermediate host for these parasites thrived in the ecologies of the irrigation canals and drains that facilitated perennial irrigation in Egypt. So here's an image of some of these two species of snails that serve as the intermediate host for parasites. So in rural villages that depended on the Nile for their water, canals quickly became centers of village life. So approaching the Nile could be treacherous, especially when the river ran high and fast during the flood. And at the turn of the 19th century, when Egyptian villages lacked running water, canals became the site of a whole host of activities. Men labored in these waterways, women fetched water and washed clothes in them, and also children often swam in their waters when the temperature soared, especially in the summer. In a landscape that was also devoid of cover, canals were common sites at which to urinate and defecate. And this was especially true for male cultivators who were engaged in the act of irrigation. So I want to put up a quick slide to explain how one becomes infected with schistosomiasis, which happens when unbroken human skin is penetrated by a schistosoma parasite whose eggs are released from the human body in both urine and feces. So once these eggs make contact with fresh water, they hatch, and the parasite becomes infective if the water also contains the tiny freshwater snails that serve as the parasite's intermediate hosts. Now, in the early 1930s, in areas with access to perennial irrigation, infection with schistosoma parasites averaged about 60%. In some towns of the Nile Delta, where perennial irrigation and cotton cultivation first took root, rates of infection exceeded 90%. In addition, it was not uncommon to be infected with both species of the parasite that causes schistosomiasis. Now, as a point of statistical comparison, in areas of southern Egypt that continue to practice basin irrigation, infection averages hovered at around 5%. Now, I want to pause here and really emphasize that the perennial Nile was associated with a kind of regional geography of disease, in which areas that had access to perennial irrigation above that lay to the north of that irrigation frontier, there were fundamentally different experiences of the human body and of pain in those regions. So next, I want to move on and talk a bit about hookworm. The creature which causes it is featured in this slide. So the spread of perennial irrigation also encouraged the transmission of hookworm, which is passed through feces that are deposited on soil. With the introduction of perennial irrigation, the earth no longer dried following the harvest of crops, thus becoming a more suitable habitat for the hookworm parasites that lived in soil while these parasites waited to infect human bodies. By the early 20th century, severe hookworm infection was the most common medical condition, disqualifying potential recruits for the Egyptian army. And in 1934, a parasitologist employed by the Rockefeller Foundation named James Allen Scott estimated that among Egypt's approximate 12 million inhabitants, about 5 million individuals were infected with hookworm. Now, finally, as perennial irrigation spread, so did the cultivation of maize, which importantly could be cultivated in roughly the same season as cotton. So maize is famously a staple of the impoverished in world history. And in Egypt, this group included the peasants who labored over Egypt's colonial economy. Now, maize was eaten differently in different parts of the world, and in especially northern regions of the Egyptian countryside, it was generally eaten green and roasted, dried, or most commonly, it was ground into a flour that was made into bread. So while maize fed, it did so at a price. Those who relied too heavily on its consumption developed a deficiency of tryptophan in their systems and ultimately a shortage of niacin in their bodies. Now, what this meant is that if a body without metabolically available niacin, so this niacin is central to the production of nucleic acids, which are the body's most important biomolecules, and also niacin is central to the release of energy from carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So in short, those who relied too heavily on the consumption of corn and suffered from pellagra were missing the basic elements necessary for healthy cellular function. Descriptions of pellagra's ravages in Egypt are plentiful. Studies of pellagra are more difficult to come by than those of schistosomiasis and hookworm because it was more difficult to diagnose. But one study performed in 1902 in the province of Gharbeya revealed that among 315 Egyptian men, 36% exhibited the visible symptoms of pellagra. So I just want to say quickly that there are photographs, plentiful photographs from Egypt during this period that were taken by physicians of individuals suffering the symptoms of pellagra. I don't include them in my book or in talks because of the issues of consent that surely, or the lack thereof, that surely attended to these photographs when they were taken by these physicians. And I'm happy to talk about that more in our discussion. So the prevalence of disease along the perennial Nile River produced new normative habitations of the human body. Now, while each of the diseases that I have described produces its own set of symptoms, cultivators usually suffered from more than one disease. They also suffered particularly severe manifestations of disease. With respect to schistosomiasis and hookworm, the repeat infections produced by continuous environmental contact could produce complex and painful experiences of these different diseases. Now, to inhabit a rural body in the period of Egypt's colonial economy, and especially a laboring body, included various combinations of the following experiences: fatigue, fever, aching, cough, diarrhea, blood in the urine, cancer of the bladder, high blood pressure through the liver, an enlarged spleen, the buildup of fluid in the abdomen, swollen areas in the esophagus and digestive tract that could rupture and bleed, weight loss, abdominal pain, severe anemia, stunted growth, difficulty concentrating, a gnawing, throbbing pain in the upper gastrum, or this area on the chest, flatulence, constipation, impotence, fluid retention in various regions of the body, a photosensitive rash that appeared in spring, vomiting, and disorders of the nervous system that cause memory loss, depression, and eventually dementia. Now, I wanted to name a group, a set of these symptoms to really emphasize the severe physical pain and hardship that attended agricultural labor and agricultural life more broadly within the kind of territories of Egypt's colonial economy. So the symptoms that I just mentioned were so common that those laboring over agriculture understood some of these symptoms to constitute normative habitations of the body. So for example, the blood in the urine that often accompanies schistosomiasis was understood as a form of male menstruation. And this made a lot of sense because oftentimes boys would begin to exhibit this blood in the urine when they began the work of irrigation, which happened during adolescence. So during the interwar period, the pain of this disease was also complemented by that of treatment for schistosomiasis and hookworm. So by the 1940s, nearly 500,000 Egyptians passed through treatment centers each year to undergo a painful month-long series of injections. Most of the time, the effects of this treatment, these injections, were erased with their return to rural life. So I described these treatment campaigns at length in the last chapter of my book. Now, I'd like to close today with an image that shows the eggs of schistosoma parasites trapped in the tissues of the human body. Now, I want to end with this image because I think it shows something quite clearly, and that is that long after Egypt's political economy had ceased to be defined by the patterns of colonial economic production that had created the channels of labor, multi-species relationality, and production that carried schistosoma parasites into the bodies of those who worked and lived on the Nile River, schistosomiasis continued to represent one of Egypt's primary challenges in the field of public health. So throughout much of the second half of the 20th century, schistosomiasis continued to be a lingering manifestation of the effects of colonial economy on constructions of subjectivity, embodied subjectivity. Even with evolutions of identity and political subjectivity, especially under Gamal Abdel Nasser during the 1950s and the 1960s, for many, the bodily effects of political economy and the political economy of an earlier period would persist. So I want to argue strongly that the histories of political economy are also environmental histories, and environmental histories, bodily histories. So this was true with respect to Egypt's colonial economy, and it remains true today, obviously not only in Egypt, but in a wide range of contexts. In Egypt's colonial economy in particular, authority took root and became tangible through the practices of perennial agriculture. The Nile River also helped to shape technocratic knowledge, and the bodies of those who inhabited rural communities were transformed through the environmental intimacies that constituted their daily lives. I'm going to close here and open the floor for discussion and questions. I want to thank you for your time and especially for your patience through the Zoom problems that I can never seem to triumph over. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully open the floor for discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Jennifer Derr, for sharing so much of your book, but also so much of the kind of thinking and stakes behind the project and how you laid it out. I know people are still working on developing some questions since you just ended. And in order to give them some time, I was wondering if I could pose a question specifically about method and political economy, because I think, you know, one of the things that's quite remarkable about your work is your emphasis on the lived experience and the bodily experience. And that is just something that in large part has escaped not all, but most work on political economy of the Middle East, you know, not just Egypt. And again, I'm not saying it's the only work that does that, but it tends to be a very rare ability and endeavor. So I'm wondering about your motivation to emphasize and focus the lived experience and the bodily experience. Is that something you came to the project with? Or is that something that kind of emerged in the sources and you kind of ran with it? And, you know, what would you say to those of us working on political economy of the Middle East to combine the way you do so well, the kind of broad structural and contingent factors along with not just questions of consciousness, but questions of, again, bodily and lived experience?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ziad. I think that's a great question. It has a complicated answer. You know, I think the first the first observation that I would make is it actually wasn't something that I came to the project with. And in fact, that piece of the book was really the kind of last piece to develop, and the piece for me that needed the most thinking and the most time to develop. So I want to say a few things about how I think political economy has developed within the historiography of the Middle East, and how this embodied piece gets brought into political economy. I think an observation that I would offer is that I think, I was trained by a historian of labor and historian of political economy more broadly in graduate school. And so, I spent the early portions of graduate school and really the early part of my career kind of enmeshed in the historiography of labor. And I would make the argument that much of that historiography is a historiography that is, especially in the 1980s and early 1990s, is really kind of laser focused on questions of subjectivity, especially when it comes to questions of class solidarity, and also the role of labor in national movements or nationalist movements and in political movements more broadly, not only anti-colonial political movements, but also obviously mid-century anti-colonial political movements in a different context. And so this question of subjectivity, I think, is centered within the literature, but I think that there's a lot of work to be done in thinking about how we imagine subjectivity and how we imagine historical subjects more broadly. I think for me that part of my kind of attraction to this question of embodiment and physical subjectivity, some of that came from reading the kind of rich literature of Egyptian agriculture that almost always mentioned the problem of schistosomiasis or bilharzia, but really did no analytical work with that. So, it almost always is raised within the historiography, but really there's no kind of analysis or historical thought that has existed around that issue. And so, certainly it caught my attention. I do think also that as I started to think about that question, there are historians who work in other parts of the world who have really thought less about subjectivity, but rather about the centrality of environmental disease to particular political economic formations. So a primary example of that happens in California, and specifically with disease, which is often cancer, which is caused by pesticides that were used and impacted farm labor in California. But I also think, I think it was pretty clear, you and I know I spent a lot of time in Egypt, and much of the time I spent writing this book was time actually in Cairo. And so the physical toll of agricultural labor and of rural life more broadly, that's a physical toll that is really evident when one is sort of thinking in place about the historical role that agriculture has played, and also like what that does in the present. I'm answering your question with the longest answer ever, but the last thing that I want to say, and I'd be happy to talk about this more, is that I think, a really difficult thing about this book, and something that I think is a tricky methodological issue that I don't think I would never argue I've found the perfect solution to this, is that, pain, people often don't talk about their pain in the archive, and how we imagine pain and disease is a historically contingent question, right? So it's a dangerous thing to imagine our bodies as they exist in any human moment or any historical moment back on other histories and other times and other contexts. I think that's a tricky thing to do methodologically. And it's an uneasy thing for me. And so I think that archival question, the kind of where do you find pain? How do you understand pain? And what kinds of questions can you treat, and what kinds of questions are beyond our reach? I think that's a really tricky one.
Thank you so much. That answer was not too long at all. In fact, I could listen to you talk about that for quite some time, because I think really that's one of several really powerful and convincing aspects of your work. We're going to turn it to a couple of other questions. I'm going to ask people to keep their cameras off just because of the trickiness of the connection and the broadcast, okay. But I will call on you. So Ziad, you have a question or comment? I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Derr. That was excellent. So I guess my question is, obviously, as you mentioned, technocrats and experts and the knowledge that they bring is historically contingent, and it's obviously something that you bring up, and it's obviously something that we know from the works of Timothy Mitchell as something. So this expertise and this technocracy is reproduced or is contingent upon specific conditions that needs to be historicized all the time. So I guess I have a methods question, which is at least how did you go about trying to figure out how the experts' engagement with the field or with the subject of their expertise, or people who are at the other end of their projects, methodologically at least, how do you go about figuring out how that experience shaped the specific expertise, right? Because that's something I'm struggling with personally, because I'm working on something kind of similar, and I have all this material and document pertaining to experts, and I don't want to have that overwhelm the perception of the subject and render, and I want to actually, but I know the fact that experience has changed their perception of what knowledge is. So how did you go about doing this, and any tips? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great, I love these questions about methodology. They're the most fun questions. So thank you. That's a great question. So I think I would say a few different things. So I think that, the one answer to that question is I spent a lot of time reading not only public works reports, but also, especially in the colonial period, obviously there's a lot of published material, but I also had like smaller pieces of those reports from Darul when I was working in Cairo. And so I could see some of the disjuncture between who was reporting from the field, and often that it was done in Arabic and not by these kind of high-ranking British engineers, and then what was being published in these public works reports. And so some of the methodological question came from a kind of archival dialogue that I was seeing in different kinds of sources. But I also want to say, I think that, as I was immersed in that literature, I think one of the things that really stood out to me is that, there's some great, really detailed, really archivally grounded work that describes the British project to engineer the Nile, but really not all of that work begins with the idea that British engineers were obviously skilled and obviously knew what they were doing when they came to Egypt. And the more reading I did about British engineering as a training system, what was going on in Britain during the period, some of the early engineering projects that were happening in northern India, but also the more reading I did about the practice of agriculture in northern India, it became clear to me that there was no way that those engineers arrived in Egypt with any sort of expert knowledge of irrigation engineering or construction in those contexts, right? So there's a moment that I describe in my book that happens right after Khazan Aswan is built and right before the first project to raise it, which happens a few short years after it's completed. And there's a kind of moment of panic because new statistical modelings have come out, or I should say new mathematical models have been produced that make a different argument for how strain and stress will wear on a dam. So people are deeply afraid that the dam's going to fall down. And so the first project to raise the dam is also a more subtle project to repair the dam based on a kind of shifting realm of knowledge. And so I think, I think for me, it was really important to think carefully and to question some of the basic assumptions that played into the historiography, and to place those assumptions in conversation with an archive. And another piece of that was that, I knew that Egypt had a school of engineering, which taught mathematics and science before the British ever built a formal school of engineering, right? So there were just all these pieces that didn't make sense to me in the story. I would also say that I think it became really important to my thinking to think about how expertise is always a performance. And it's a performance that's made through things like scholarly talks, things like the construction of dams, things like the publication of books. And so once I started to think about how British engineers were endeavoring to perform their own expertise, and some of that performance was associated with building an agricultural environment and an environment of engineering that they understood and could master, rather than expanding one that was incredibly foreign to them, right? And so I think, I think it's really important to think, when one is thinking about environmental outcomes, to not assume that those environmental outcomes are given, or that the individuals involved in their construction have any kind of perfect vision, but rather to think about why particular environments are made. And I mean why in a story about science, not just a story about cotton, and what's at stake for the experts who are involved in the making of those particular environments. Again, super long question. Ziad, did that answer your question? Or do you have a follow-up question? I see that there are things in the chat. Okay, okay.
It helps a lot, thank you. It did, thank you.
Okay.
Allow me to guide you through a few additional questions.
Great.
Absolutely.
Great.
I mean, I won't parse. I'll just relay. But first, to save time and to also express, the kind of gratitude people have. Mona says, "Thank you for the amazing talk." Dalia says, "Amazing work and lucid presentation." And thank you for a great lecture, just echoing the different things. I'm seeing a couple of theoretical questions and a couple of practical or what we could call empirical questions. If anyone will allow me with, are we still allowed to make that distinction? I'm just joking. One of the questions has to do with the relationship of your work to questions of political economy, and specifically how you engage with literature within Marxist ecology, and works like Jason Moore, who've also sought to connect production of nature to political economy and development of capitalism, and materiality. So that's one question. Would you like me to just flag the other two questions for you, Jen, or would you like to take one by one?
No, go ahead. And I think I was looking at some of these. Go ahead and flag, and maybe.
Okay. So another empirical question has to do with the kind of relationship between British colonialism in Egypt and British colonialism in India. So Dalia asks, British colonial administrators and public works engineers should have had witnessed similar epidemiological developments in India as a result of their irrigation and technological transformations, and could such predicaments have ever been resisted, evaded? Were they, consciously brought into the fold as people were dealing with Egypt? There are. I also want to just share a personal anecdoted question from Ala that says, "Thank you for a great lecture. Fascinated by your approach. Remember as a kid all the governmental ads on bilharzia, and that it was very central topic in school curricula. We read a couple of famous Egyptian biographies in school, and they died by bilharzia. She was so afraid from it, and remembers always checking with her father and grandfather, who are from Gharbiya, if they ever swim in the lake and if they are sure. And that the current generations don't necessarily know about bilharzia, but Ala says, it really shaped her thinking of the scary, uncivilized village. and wanted to ask you if you could talk about how this body in pain exists in a certain hierarchy of class, space, and race. So those are a couple of questions that could take you in multiple directions, but I wanted to give you the chance to address them in whatever way you see form, and then we'll hit up some of the other questions because there are many more.
Okay. Those are great questions. If I lose track of, as I'm answering, if I lose track, make sure to, I'll go back to the chat and be nudged. So I wanted to start with this question of Marxist political economy and Jason Moore. I think this is a good question, and it's something I actually thought a lot about when I was writing my book. You know, I teach Moore's work. I think it's a really important work. I would also say that from my own reading of Marxist, from my own reading of Marxian political economy, I never imagined a world of Marxian political economy in which the environment was not also implicated, right? As a source, as a shifting set of relations, as a fundamental dynamic to how we will live capitalist futures, and especially late capitalist futures, which have arrived. But so I think that as a broader framework, I think that, my work very much exists within that framework. But I think that in some ways I'm less concerned with the structural questions of global capitalism that sort of attend to that body of literature. I think that's very much the kind of background for the work I do. And I want to say that since this book, I've moved sort of more firmly into the histories of science and medicine, but also, the way I understand those histories are still deeply connected to questions of political economy and questions of environmental transformation. So I think that is the world in which I write. But I also think that in my mind, historiographically, what is really helpful is to write those stories specifically, and also to write human subjects back into those stories, right? So to think about, and I think it's really important when one is thinking about bodily transformation to not just talk about bodies, but to talk about human beings, because that slippage is really easy to make when you're thinking about science. And so, I think more is helpful as a broader framework, but I think I also have some skepticism of the total novelty of that work. I think that for many people who are thinking critically about questions of capitalism, questions of political economy, and even within a more contemporary framework shaped by climate change, those kinds of questions, I think, animate more specific pieces of historiography. And so I think I would love to have that conversation at length with you, because it's something I've thought about a lot. And I think that for me, working on the book and also working on my dissertation, one of the things I had to sort of sort through is what were the works that I needed to specifically engage in a really direct way? And what were the works that functioned as kind of world creating works that would set the terms and the rules of that world, but maybe I didn't need to walk through every piece of those arguments. And I think, I think every book does that. And I think for me, Moore's work was it existed in the genre of world creating works rather than specific empirical works. Okay, I wanted to jump to a next question. Oh, I wanted to answer a question about India, also talk about Bilharzia in the second half of the 20th century in Egypt. There's television commercials. I have also seen them. Some of them are on YouTube. And Hashem Salem also can do an amazing rendition of one by voice. Ziad, have you heard this? There's a performance. And also, talk about some of the labor that built the dam. So, the dam was built. So just I'll say a few quick words about financing for the dam and the labor that built the dam. So the dam was financed like many pieces of colonial infrastructure, in the sense that it was financed with an initial loan by Ernest Cassell. That was a loan that was paid back to Kassel by the Egyptian government. Also shares were sold to colonial investors in order to finance that dam. And I have that story sort of laid out in more detail in the book. The labor that built the dam, I think that's something that I really worked to figure through, and I think there's a lot more work to be done there. So when I had started my dissertation research, and my dissertation is a really different piece of work than my book, but when I'd started my dissertation research, one of the primary things I was looking for at Darul Sa'iq was specific records of labor that were tied to the construction of the dam. I found pieces of that, but I only found pieces of it in a kind of later period of research after the archive had been cataloged in a different way. There could be other pieces of that in Darul Sa'iq. It's always a little bit tricky to say with that archive, especially if one is working in the late 19th and early 20th century. The documents that you have access to, that's a shifting question. And that is a question that is difficult to get access right now. And so some of the pieces, some of the descriptions of labor came from those documents that I found in Darul Sa'iq. Others came from sort of British reports of irrigation. The Greek and Italian pieces, those are laborers that are mentioned quite often. Those are also laborers that in photos of the construction process, and I used photos to figure out certain things about labor, but it was really common in the late 19th and early 20th century in Egypt, but also throughout North Africa on large infrastructure projects to have this kind of mixed labor force, in which, especially in the late 19th century, what was most common is for Greeks and Italians to be hired to do skilled labor. Egyptians were hired to do unskilled labor for these large infrastructural projects. And so I was aware that that was a possibility, and then it sort of, it arises in the sources. I think I don't work in Greek or Italian. I think that someone who does work in Greek or Italian, I think there is, Ilham Khoury-Makdisi's book, there is an emerging body of literature that I think thinks really critically about Southern European migration to North Africa and the political consequences of that, but also the economic consequences of that. So I think that especially if someone who works in Greek and Italian, I think I do suspect there is a different kind of range of sources at consulates in different national archives that describe the kind of diverse labor force that built the dam. Race was always important in structuring labor in this period. So, skilled labor was done by Europeans almost all of the time during this early period, and unskilled labor was left for Egyptians. And so labor was always heavily racialized. And, that question of race is quite central to the book. Race is a question when it comes to labor. Race is also a question when we start to think about colonial medicine, because especially in the 19th century, with emerging ideas of germ theory within the practice of medicine, for European doctors who are in Egypt, and there are many of them who are posted to work in Egypt and actively seek out those posts because it's seen as a place that not only has established medical institutions, but this kind of rich realm of research and parasitic disease, and in particular hookworm and schistosomiasis. The presence of those diseases becomes one means through which colonial doctors understand Egyptian bodies as racialized and, by extension, less clean than European bodies during this period. So that question, race comes out in many different ways in the book, but specifically through the practice of medicine, and also, of course, and always through labor hierarchies and labor regimes. I quickly wanted to answer this question about India and endemicity, because I think it has two answers to it. So the first answer to that question is that so one reason that the British don't anticipate the appearance of disease in Egypt, and specifically in relation to schistosomiasis, is that schistosomiasis wasn't endemic in India. So you don't have the same landscape of disease that emerges in India with the construction of irrigation works. That happens in other places in the world. It happens in Brazil, it happens in Japan, it happens in China. But this connection between irrigation and disease and schistosomiasis is a connection that is in part made through the structure of irrigation works and in part made through questions of ecology and questions of endemicity. Something else that I would point out is that, interestingly enough, the British are building things in India before they come to Egypt, but much of the agricultural infrastructure that's built in the north of India, and specifically in the region of Punjab, is built after and during the British occupation of Egypt. So those things are happening at the same time. So that many of the prominent engineers who come from India to Egypt to work on irrigation works have been building things in India, but slightly different forms of infrastructure. And so the ability to anticipate is also limited by this question of chronology and when particular kinds of projects were happening in different realms of the empire. Okay. Oh, so I wanted to say something to Alette, and thinking about sort of like the specter of schistosomiasis in rural Egypt. Just for people who are not immersed in this, schistosomiasis continues to be a huge problem in Egypt, really until the 1980s and the 1990s. And even after that, it continues to exist. Part of the reason that happens is an infrastructure question. So, in rural areas that still lack easy access to running water, but also just in agricultural areas in which people did interact with irrigation canals, schistosomiasis continues to be a huge issue. So especially during the 1950s and the 1960s, it's one of the major projects of Nasser's state. Interestingly enough, it is more of a point of continuity than it is of change when we compare the interwar period to the Nasserist period. So the public health programs that are built under the interwar period regime in the 1930s and the 1940s, those are public health programs that are largely expanded during the 1950s and the 1960s. And there's a lot of consistency in the types of treatments that are being used to combat schistosomiasis, really beginning in the 1930s and stretching through the late 1970s. So it's the development of a new treatment that's, oral, less toxic, and can be used preventatively that really starts to reduce numbers of schistosomiasis in Egypt. But throughout the second half of the 20th century, this campaign really to defeat the disease, it continues, and it changes shape in some ways. And specifically in its attachment to a state that has a more robust public health infrastructure, and for whom post-colonialism is deeply attached to questions of health more broadly. Also, in the second half of the 20th century, international actors become involved in large ways. That's a different story. But I think, it is really, as an experience, I think it's really important in 20th century Egypt, and thinking about, it's crucial to what people understand about rural life, whether one is from a rural area or not from a rural area. It becomes the kind of point at which many people interact with the state's medical system. So those things are also tightly linked. It is also deeply attached to the significance and the value of what it means to dam the Nile River, not only early in the century, but also to build the Aswan Dam. And so it continues to be central to these kinds of, I think, really important shifts in national identity and how people understand the countryside. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jen. I know you're reading the questions. We have a couple of more questions. One, trying to think about British colonialism in the Middle East, comparing French and British colonialism in the Middle East and the Maghreb with questions of modernization, of agriculture, and kind of their legacies for post-colonial state development and formation, in particular vis-a-vis the rural areas. To think about that. I'd also like to throw in a question here somewhat related to this. And, in terms of Egypt, there is such emphasis on questions of the rural and political economy. But, my sense of the return of political economy, if you will, or the new political economy in Middle East studies has also largely, not exclusively, but largely focused on the urban. And I was wondering if, in responding to this question by Ali about French versus British and colonial versus post-colonial period vis-a-vis the rural areas, you could reflect a little bit on the rural question in the field of the political economy of the Middle East.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think something that has became, as I was writing this book, really fundamental to how I understood the impact of British colonialism in Egypt is that, having now spent more time in the history of the Atlantic world and specifically the histories of colonialism in Latin America and in South America, something that I think about more often is that the Middle East has a different history of colonialism, and in some ways, one that is more infrastructural, one that is more economic, and one that is really concentrated in these later periods, right? And so I think that when I thought about British colonialism in the writing of this book, something that I had to contend with is that while the project to dam the Nile was very much a British project, it became very much an Egyptian project during the interwar period, and it has continued to be very much an Egyptian project. And so I think it's really easy to read my book as an expression of the terrible things that have been done by colonialism in Egypt. And I think that is an accurate reading, but I think it's also a more complex story, because when we think about the significance of damming, when we start to talk about infrastructure as post-colonial, I think that's a story that really begins to emerge in the 1930s and the 1940s. I think Bob Vitalis does a great job of talking about that story specifically in Egypt. The question about a comparison with the French, I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. I know that there is work that's happening right now about these environmental projects that were supported by the French in the Mandate period, and then also in Lebanon. And so I think that there's probably an emerging conversation about that, but someone who works in Lebanon or Syria, I think would have a more kind of sophisticated answer to what those questions of infrastructure, how those questions of infrastructure are fundamental to a late colonial project that happens both with respect to British colonialism and French colonialism in the region. Something that I think now that I'm working on a book project that's a book project that is a later book project chronologically, I think something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, which I understand you will be talking with Dr. Saïli about, is this question of the post-colonial, right? So how do we, this question of the post-colonial and the decolonial. And so, specifically in the context of this book, eventually, and it happens pretty early, the construction of infrastructure on the Nile will become a dramatically decolonial project, right? It's a decolonial project that builds on many of the political agreements and ways of environmental understanding that were built up during the colonial period, but certainly both the interwar period regime and also Nasser's regime. And also today, when we think about this controversy, this live controversy in Egypt about the Grand Renaissance Dam that's been built in Ethiopia, and I mean, what will happen with that dam in terms of the politics of Egypt and the Horn of Africa? I think that we need to be careful about using the terms post-colonial and decolonial in context, and really thinking about the kinds of specific entanglements with those terms. With respect to French colonialism, like I said, I really want to wait until individuals who we know, who I believe have passed through this institute and are maybe planning it, who are working on questions of environmental engineering in French territories. I think that's a great comparative question. But I think that, yeah, we'll see. Would self-coloniality fit better? Oh, I mean, I would probably say no, but I'm definitely going to think about this when we get off this talk today. And I think the reason that my first answer is to sort of push back against that term might be to think more broadly about the deep connections between colonial economies and nationalist movements, between broader practices of capitalism in later periods and forms of the post-colonial. And so I think that if one wants to think about a broadly decolonial approach to infrastructure, it would also entail some significant disentangling from how we understand questions of the nation and questions of liberation in relation to broader capitalist structures. And you know, even in the 50s and the 60s, with the kind of, you know, heyday of the rhetoric about non-alignment and those kinds of questions, you know, in complicated ways, national economies are still being formed in relationship to global capitalism, and quite deliberately so. And so I won't use the term self-coloniality yet. There was another question. Yeah, Ziad. Did you want to, Ziad, I feel like you might have more complicated things to say about that than I just said.
I am here taking notes and learning. Definitely nothing more complicated. As always, a pleasure. I do think there's something to, I mean, all of us that work on the Middle East and the political economy of the Middle East have to constantly wrestle with the place of Egypt in knowledge production on broader comparative questions of political economy and Middle East history. But I don't have anything to add to it. I just think there's a big, you know, I think the comparative question is critical in both to shed light on what's happening elsewhere, but to think about what's happening. I wanted to, you know, we have about 15 minutes left. Oh, go ahead, Jen.
You would also ask this question about the urban.
Yeah, the urban rural, you know, and it's, you know, and how political economy or Middle East studies has dealt with or deals with it.
So I think you're absolutely right about the kind of fixation. Well, I think there's a split fixation within Middle East political economy about how we think about rural and urban, right? Because the rural space becomes the space through which we think about broader colonial economic structures, questions of land tenure, those kinds of questions. But then when we shift to labor and we start to think about questions of organization, questions of subjectivity, we're almost always talking about urban laborers. And so in a certain sense, in my work, I wanted to push back against that. We think about labor subjectivity as an urban question, as an organized question, those kinds of issues. And so I think that's one way I would respond to that question. Another way I would respond to that question is that I don't think there's anything specific about an analytical approach that thinks through the relationship between political economy and environmental transformation. There's nothing explicitly rural about that, right? So that is an urban question as much as it is a rural question. And in some ways, I would argue maybe even more of an urban question. There's much more work to be done. And the kind of intensity of environmental relations in urban spaces, especially rapidly industrializing urban spaces, you know, that question of Marxian political ecology, that's an urban question as much as it is a rural question. And so, you know, especially, and, you know, I think this also comes up within environmental history circles, right? This kind of fixation on nature and the rural. And I think, you know, when I think of the quote unquote environment, I'm thinking about a broader material world, and there's nothing in particular, you know, for me personally, and in my analytical approach, the concept of quote unquote nature does no real work, right? So I'm much more working with this sense of materiality, which is as much an urban question as a rural question. And so my hope is that as the quote unquote new political economy moves forward, that some of those environmental questions will be asked about urban spaces. As a more specific comment, I do also think it's really important to point out that in large cities that are expanding rapidly, especially beginning in the 1930s, and I'm thinking about Cairo and Alexandria in particular, but this would also certainly apply to other large cities in the region. Many populations live in these spaces which are neither quite rural or urban, right? So they live in cities, but they oftentimes live without the infrastructure of cities. They practice small scale farming within cities. So with schistosomiasis in particular, many people are becoming infected in canals that exist basically in Cairo, right? And so it feels, I think that feels more rural than it is. And I think this question of what people call the peri-urban, which sounds like too dry of a category for me, but you know, we've talked about this in ethnographic work and anthropological work about, you know, when we think about Cairo and think about these new settlements and what it means to live without infrastructure. So those questions have been examined, but I also think that what does that mean as an environmental experience and an embodied experience? I think that's a really important question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes left, and if you don't mind, I'm going to lean in and try to take advantage of them. I know you're also, by the way, in a Mediterranean time zone, and so this is actually the end of your day, not the start or middle of your day, as it is for many people. So you know, we really appreciate it. There are a few questions that are asking specifically, I think, about things that you're quite articulate about in your introduction or in your conclusion or in your book. So I'm going to encourage people to, you know, really dig into the book for some of those questions. We have about 9 minutes left, and you know, most of the audience members are working on their dissertations. So I have to kind of ask the question about, you know, looking back at your own experience and, you know, the training you do for graduate students at your own school, department, and center, you know, if I could, you know, put you on the spot, any things you wish you did differently, or you wish you could go back and tell your dissertating self, you know, beyond the, you know, generic stuff that we get told, you know, in graduate school orientation. I would love to hear it for the benefit of the participants, but also to help amplify that when I talk to other people.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, one thing that I would say that I used to not say so publicly, but now all the materials are available, so it's very clear. I wrote a really different book than my dissertation. And so my book is in some ways very much not my dissertation. It's like I wrote two very different things on a common set of themes. But I did a lot of research in between my dissertation and my book, and it changed pretty significantly. And so I think for me, it was important to remember that, especially between the dissertation and the book, that as you sit with a project, it will evolve. Now, I don't think everybody's projects will or should evolve as much as mine did, but I think it's really important to think about the dissertation as your first polished take on a particular subject and a set of questions, but one that you will have a kind of the ability to approach again. You know, I also think that for me specifically, it was really important to put down my dissertation for a little while, and to stop thinking about it so that I could think about it again. You know, something I think about a lot, kind of continuously, is how you reproduce the effect of time and distance, and its positive impact on your thoughts, right? So to do something, to put it down, to come back to it, and to let it shift and to let it evolve, which for me, I think happens really radically. Like when I put something down and come back to it, that's almost always when I have my best thoughts about it, but there's no way for me to do that without actually putting it down. And so I think the other thing that I would say, and I think this is especially true right now, is the question of archives, and specifically the conventional archive, has become much more difficult and much more challenging at many places in the Middle East. And I think that, I know when I was working, especially in my dissertation, but it was probably the period in which people had the most access and the most openness to archives in Egypt, specifically Darul Wasaiq. And so, I think it's really important to remember that the archive is a place, but not just a place, right? And to think really creatively about what we can use for archives, and to not be kind of deflated by a particular lack of access that I think people who work in many, many places are suffering from right now. But to realize that while not being able to access those archives, it's always a loss. But at the same time, the sort of push to think more creatively and more aggressively, and from the side, I think there can be real benefits to that. And so I think that, to think, always the advice is to think creatively about the archive. But, I think the reality is that right now people have to do that, especially in our field. And so, I think those are the things that I would say.
Thank you so much, Jen. The lecture was, even for someone who's read the book 1.5 times and looks forward to going back to it, and was really insightful, both in terms of what your arguments are and the stakes, and your willingness to share so openly your questions, your challenges, your accomplishments, and your regrets in some way, is really, really helpful and honest. I'd really like to encourage those that haven't read the Living the Nile River, Materiality, Embodiment in Egypt's Colonial Economy, from Stanford University Press in 2019, and winner of the 2020 Political Economy Project Book Prize, to check it out. I personally believe it has become required reading in modern Middle East history, and in Middle East political economy, let alone the broader comparative fields beyond the Middle East. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our participants for their engagement, their questions. We really look forward to building on what you've shared with us today, as PESI, as scholars, as researchers, and we look forward to having you back at the Political Economy Summer Institute at some point, perhaps in another capacity.
Well, I wanted to thank all of you, especially for being patient with my difficulties with Zoom, which happens inevitably. And so thank you so much for your deep engagements. The best thing about writing a book, I think, is talking about the book and being able to talk about it with other people, and for all of us to learn from one another. So I really appreciate the great questions, and hopefully I will have the opportunity to see you in another capacity and space moving forward.
Thank you, Jen. Just a reminder to our participants that we're having about an hour break, and then you're having your research breakout sessions, which has a designated Zoom link. And for those of you that are based, of course, in the US and North America, you will receive further instructions when you log in there. Thank you, everybody. Jen, thank you, كتير, يعطيك العافية. And we will download the chat for your records, just so you have a sense of the questions. And of course, we'll share a recording with you of the lecture. Thank you, everybody, and see you later.